I remember the first sensation, the weight of chains biting into my wrists, the acrid taste of blood and fear mingling on my tongue. The air of Camorra, the dark city, carried with it no comfort. Only the unending screams of prey consumed in endless cycles of torment. I was among them, once captured, broken, processed like cattle for the Dark Elder's hunger. Yet from the moment I was dragged into their labyrinthine alleys of cruelty, I knew survival would not be gifted. It would have to be calculated, stolen, forged in the crucible of pain. The Dark Eldar do not kill swiftly. Death is too merciful. Their artistry thrives in prolonging existence, reshaping it into something that sustains their own hollow souls. I became property of the Homunculi, their twisted artisans of flesh. My humanity was stripped away piece by piece, not through annihilation, but through transformation, skin flayed, bones reforged, nerves rewired until I was no longer a man but a living Tula. Rack, designed to serve as instrument, specimen, and proof of their mastery. And yet, even in the depths of mutilation, something remained unbroken. My mind clung to the smallest fragments of identity, whispering a truth my body tried to forget. That chains, no matter how strong, could one day be shattered. The Homunculi prized me as an experiment, where other slaves screamed until madness consumed them. I calculated, I observed, I adapted. Their laboratories of cruelty became my academy of survival. Each incision, each forced augmentation taught me not despair, but new equations of possibility. Pain was data. Suffering was a teacher. They thought they were raising me, but instead they refined me into something unanticipated. In those shadowed vaults of torment, I met Kel, not slave, not tormentor, but something other, being touched by temporal instability, caught between moments, existing half a step outside conventional reality. The Homunculi dissected his condition with obsessive fascination, yet never truly controlled him. He was both prisoner and anomaly, his form flickering in and out of sync with linear time. To others, he was a curiosity. To me, he was proof that chains could be bent, twisted, slipped through. We spoke in the stolen silences between procedures, our words fragments hidden beneath the notice of our captors. He spoke of intersections, points where reality folded in on itself, where choice could rewrite destiny. I listened, and for the first time since my capture, the horizon of possibility widened beyond mere survival. But survival remained my first equation. Camorra was a city of endless predation, where even hesitation was death. The incubi, silent executioners bound to the service of cabals, stalked the halls like shadows carved into armor. The cabals waged their eternal wars of betrayal and spectacle, every alliance a prelude to treachery, and above them all, the constant hunger of she who thirsts the Dark Elder's eternal doom, forever consuming their souls unless fed with endless torment. I was a tool in that system, but tools can be sharpened into weapons. My modifications granted me strength beyond my original flesh, reflexes honed by suffering, cognition sharpened by neural rewiring. I calculated angles of possibility others dismissed. If the Homunculi saw me as a success of their craft, they failed to see that their creation thought beyond its programming. Lady Malice, patroness of the Homunculi who claimed me, rarely visited her laboratories, but her shadow loomed in every act of cruelty. They said her mind was sharper than any scalpel, her schemes spanning centuries, her loyalty given only to herself. To her, I was both an asset and a curiosity, a tool of potential value, perhaps even amusement. She underestimated me, as predators often do their prey. The turning point came with the disjunction. Rare, cataclysmic instability in the webway itself. Reality shuddered, pathways twisted, and Camorra trembled at the edge of collapse. Systems failed, protocols shattered for most. It was disaster. For me, it was opportunity. Kel saw it first. His desynchronized perception allowed him to glimpse the fractures as they formed. "This is the moment," he whispered, his voice echoing across split timelines. "A path exists now that never will again." The homunculi faltered as their stasis fields flickered. Incubi hesitated, caught between orders and uncertainty. I stood in the center of chaos, my body scarred and augmented beyond recognition, my mind a latticework of adaptations built on years of torment. For the first time, the chains felt fragile. I understood then that escape was not simply flight. Escape was transformation. To walk free of Kamura was not enough. I had to become something the Dark Eldar could not contain, could not predict, could not define. The portal shimmered before us, unstable, colors writhing like wounds in the fabric of reality. Lady Malice's forces closed in. My master, the homunculus who had shaped me, watched with clinical detachment. "Have in awe, have in possession, consider," he said, "the rationality of your choice. You abandoned certainty for desperate uncertainty. Certainty was an illusion in a city built on betrayal. Only adaptation endured, and so, with Kel at my side, I prepared to step into the impossible, into a reality where identity itself could fracture and reform, where I might cease to be what they had made of me and become something new, not human, not Dark Eldar, not slave, not wreck, but something else, something unchained. The portal flared with unstable light, awound in the skin of reality itself. The air rippled like liquid glass, distorting sound, bending sight, unraveling the edges of what the senses could endure. I stood before it with Kel at my side, both of us marked by chains in different forms, his temporal fracture, my flesh-born modifications, and yet, in that moment, I felt the chains grow brittle. The incubi moved with lethal precision, their glides humming with murderous energy. Their loyalty to Lady Malice demanded they stop us. My master, the homunculus who had overseen my endless mutilations, issued his command. "Stop the rack. The anomaly must be contained." His words hung in the thick, shuddering air, half command, half clinical curiosity. The incubi hesitated only briefly. Their oaths bound them to Malice. But my earlier communication with her had suggested otherwise, that she recognized some use in me, some spark of value beyond a disposable tool. That hesitation was enough. Kel slipped between them, his form a blur of fractured moments, striking not with weapons but with absence. Blades meant for his heart found only the echo of where he had stood a millisecond before. I felt the weight of the homunculus's gaze. For him, this was not betrayal but experiment, to see whether his creation would fail or transcend. His voice cut through the alarms. "Certainty is advantage. Why choose?" "Uncertainty." I met his gaze, scarred lips curving into something not quite defiance, not quite respect. Certainty is illusion. Adaptation is survival. The portal roared as the calibration reached. Final sequence. The surface pulsed with colors that bled into each other in ways the human eye was never meant to perceive. Each ripple was a paradox, a possibility that both was and was not. The air cracked with the tension of multiple realities colliding. Kel's voice, sharp and urgent, anchored me to the moment. The path exists now, and only now. Intersection point aligning. Once disjunction stabilizes, it will vanish. The alarms intensified. Lady Malice was approaching. Her transport moved through Gamora at impossible speed. Her wrath carried like a storm across the webway veins. If she arrived before we crossed, there would be no escape. The incubi pressed Kel harder, their movements perfectly choreographed, but their precision failed against his fractured existence. Each strike found an absence. Each thrust pierced an afterimage. Their discipline turned to frustration. Meanwhile, my master revealed his last tool, his stasis projector. A beam of warped energy lanced outward, enveloping me in its field. The world slowed, stretched. My body rebelled against its own inertia. Thoughts dragging through treacle. Time itself threatened too. Bury me, but something had changed. Where once the stasis field had rendered me helpless, I found myself adapting. My neural augmentations, perhaps altered by long proximity to Kel's temple. Instability resisted. Consciousness remained intact. My limbs, though heavy, could still move. The homunculus's eyes glimmered with fascination. Remarkable, adaptive capacity beyond design. Perhaps more successful than intended. His voice was clinical, detached. But beneath it, I sensed something more: pride, respect, or perhaps manipulation. With a surge of effort, I tore free of the stasis field. The energy shattered round me like broken glass, dispersing into the air in patterns that reflected the temporal distortions tearing through the facility. His expression shifted. Just slightly. Go then. Evolution demands testing boundaries for a heartbeat. I faltered. Was it concession, or was it the final cruelty to let me go, framing my defiance as his triumph? His experiment reaching its natural conclusion. No time to analyze. The portal destabilized. Its window closing. Kel's hand brushed my shoulder, his form flickering with urgency. Now. Intersection manifests. The path closes with the next breath. I looked once more at the homunculus, my master, tormentor, teacher of cruel lessons. His eyes burned with detached amusement. Yet something deeper lingered. Respect, perhaps, or the echo of ownership. It did not matter. His story and mine diverged here. With Kel. I stepped forward. The portal engulfed us, its surface swallowing matter and thought alike. It was not like any transition I had ever known. Not the cold, sharp precision of webway travel, not the violent wrenching of warp translation. This was disintegration, perception fracturing into countless shards. I experienced myself as 100 possibilities, a slave who never endured, a corpse in some forgotten alley, a monster serving in silence. A man who fought back too late. Each vision flickered, real and unreal, until one thread coalesced. The moment Kel had described, Camorra as it existed years before, just after my initial capture. Before the surgeries, before the transformation. We stumbled into a shadowed corner of the dark city. The air was different, less saturated with agony, less heavy with the screams of centuries. It was still cruel, still sharp, still predatory, but younger somehow, less complete. Kel's voice came ragged, flickering with residual distortion. Temporal intersection achieved, but not escape. Not yet. I rose, feeling the strange weight of familiarity in an alien form. My body was still scarred, still augmented, but round me stood the city as it once was. I was both present and out of place. A paradox given flesh. Kel steadied himself, his desynchronization fading into equilibrium. From here, paths exist that were closed before. New branches, unfinished structures, roots not yet sealed. I understood then. We had not left Camorra. We had only stepped sideways into a moment before the chains had fully closed. Escape was not yet freedom. Escape was navigation, and somewhere nearby, in the slave pens, the earlier version of me still waited, still human, still screaming, still unaware of the transformation to come. I felt the paradox stir. If I saw him, if he saw me, what would happen? Kel's voice was quiet, solemn. We must avoid paradox. But there are pots here, and you can see them. Yes, I could. For the first time, the chains did not feel absolute. They felt like options. Escape had only begun. There is no silence in Camorra, even in the deepest chambers, where light rarely touches the walls and shadows. Cling like parasites, the city hums with the resonance of suffering. It is not the ordinary background noise of a civilization, the chatter of markets, the rhythm of industry, or the murmur of daily life. Instead, it is a symphony of torment, a constant reminder that every breath drawn within these boundaries is bought with someone else's agony. At first, this unending tide of screams, whispers, and guttural cries fractured my mind. The Dark Eldar wield pain not only as a weapon, but as a language. To them, suffering is communication and exchange of power, dominance and meaning. Each scream carries nuance, a wail that pleads for mercy, a shriek that resists to the end, a broken sob that signals surrender. To live in Camorra is to swim through an ocean where every drop is saturated with cruelty. I remember the initial days, if they can be called days, for time is warped in this place. My ears refused to adjust, my human instincts recoiling at each sound as though I, too, were being flayed alive. Yet slowly, through repetition and necessity, my perception shifted. I began to discern patterns, rhythms beneath the chaos. The torment was not random, it was orchestrated. There were crescendos of screams rising from gladiatorial pits, the sharp notes of individual punishment chambers, the low drone of collective despair from slaves who had long ceased to hope. The realization struck me with equal parts horror and fascination. Camorra itself was a living organism, and pain was its heartbeat. Kel walked beside me in those days of transformation. Though he rarely spoke, his eyes, unfocused yet intensely aware, drifted along lines of time invisible to me. Where I heard only screams, he perceived the echoes of futures and pasts converging. Sometimes he would mutter fragments. This cry will end in silence, or that shriek ripples forward, breaking chains yet to be forged. I could not always understand him, but I trusted the cadence of his words. In a world where truth itself bent to cruelty, Kel's fractured vision became an anchor. Adaptation came not through resistance, but through absorption. I began to listen differently, not as prey flinching from the predator's growl, but as a student decoding an alien dialect. Every Dark Eldar tormentor shaped suffering with precision. Their tools razor flails, venom whips. Psychic prods were instruments in an orchestra of agony. They spoke through scars and broken bones, declaring dominance in a tongue written in flesh. And though I despised it, I learned. The body retains what the mind seeks to escape. Pain imprints deeper than memory, carving its lessons into the marrow. I came to understand thresholds, the exact moment when suffering shifts from resistance to collapse, the fragile balance between agony and endurance. I recognized how they used rhythm to prolong torment, withholding relief to amplify the next strike. Against my will, I absorbed these techniques, cataloging them in the silent archive of my being. Yet, even as I learned their language, I refused their intention. They sought to make me another instrument of their design, a weaponized echo of their cruelty. But within me, a different seed germinated. Knowledge does not demand obedience, it only offers possibility. What they caught through torment I would reshape, not to dominate, but to survive and to transcend. The turning point came during one of the pit fights, where captives were thrown against one another for the amusement of their masters. I was cast into the arena, weakened but not yet broken. Round me, the crowd roared 1,000 voices exalting cruelty. My opponent, another human slave, trembled before me. I could see in his eyes the same fracture I had once carried. Terror so complete it dissolved will. The Dark Eldar expected a spectacle, a display of desperation ending in blood. But instead, I listened. The man's breath came in ragged bursts, his fear vibrating through the air. The crowd's roar layered over his panic, weaving a dissonant symphony. And beneath it all, I felt something else, the faint pulse of my own. Endurance, the rhythm carved into me through unending torment. I recognized the pattern, the language of survival disguised as pain. I reached out, not with blade or fist, but with presence. Meeting his gaze, I whispered, "Not today, not for them." His trembling stilled, if only slightly. Together we refused the expected performance. When the overseer demanded blood, we offered. Defiance locking arms, turning our suffering into a shared wall against the city's appetite. The punishment that followed was severe, yet something shifted. For the first time, I understood that even within the confines of Comora's endless cruelty, refusal was possible. Not resistance in the form of open rebellion. That path was suicide, but refusal in the sense of shaping meaning differently. Where they sought dominance, I carved solidarity. Where they orchestrated despair, I found patterns of entrance. Kell later told me, in his fragmented way, "You heard the silence between the screams." That is where freedom begins. I did not grasp the full weight of his words then, but I carried them like a hidden ember. Pain had become a teacher. Yes, but I no longer accepted it as the Dark Eldar intended. It was no longer simply their weapon. It was a language, and in learning it, I found a voice of my own. And so, within the chorus of torment, I began to whisper a different song. Pain lingers long after the wound has closed. The Dark Eldar understand this better than anyone, and they cultivate it with religious devotion. In Comora, scars are not imperfections but archives. Every line carved into flesh is a story. Every fracture in bone a lesson. Every scream drawn out over hours a signature in the ledger of torment. At first, I tried to resist remembering. I wanted to separate myself from the horrors etched into me, to treat them as foreign impositions I could cast away. But the flesh is stubborn. It remembers what the mind forgets. Even in moments of stillness, my body would tremble with echoes of blades that no longer touched me. My skin itched with phantom burns. My lungs tightened with the memory of poison that had long since dissipated. It was Kell who first helped me see differently. We sat in a chamber once used for storage. Far from the main arteries of the city, the walls still bore the stains of whatever had been held there before, but for a brief span of time, it became ours. Kell traced his fingers across the jagged scars that ran along his arm. His voice was distant, as though speaking both to me and to timelines only. He could see, "They write on us," he said, "ink of agony, quills of steel. But writing is not only for them, it is for us too." I didn't understand. My scars felt like brands, ownership marks burned into my body. But Kell explained in fragments, showing me how the flesh itself could be repurposed. The Dark Eldar wrote their stories into us. Yes, but memory is not static. Meaning shifts. Scars can be rewritten. Not in the skin itself, but in how one carries them. So I began to study my own body as though it were a map. Each mark became a territory. Each wound a border crossing. I remembered the context of its making. The pit fight. The overseer's lash. The time I refused to cry out and was punished for silence rather than noise. These memories no longer remained as raw wounds. They became catalogued knowledge. A language I could read. The mind wanted to forget, to wall off the horror. But the flesh reminded me that forgetting was impossible. Instead, transformation required acceptance, integration. The scars could not be erased, but they could be reinterpreted. What had been written as symbols of ownership became records of survival. Each mark whispered, "I endured, I adapted, I remain." The Dark Eldar never intended this. They saw only tools, broken down and remade to suit their designs, but enforcing survival upon me. They gave me something they did not foresee, resilience that was mine alone. They had created a body designed to endure torment, but within that entrance, a self began to form that was not theirs too. Control. There was a night, it must have been a night, though the cycles blur in Comora, when I dreamed vividly. In the dream, I walked the streets of Comora, the sky above a fractured kaleidoscope of stolen suns. The voices of the tormented rose round me, but instead of recoiling, I joined them. My voice added not despair, but defiance to the chorus. When I awoke, sweat covered my body, but I felt no fear. The dream had shown me what Kel meant, scars as language, pain as repurposed meaning. From then onward, I began to test my body differently. Instead of dreading the echoes of pain, I leaned into them, deciphering what they revealed. A twist in the gut might remind me of hunger used as punishment, instead of despair. I marked it as proof of survival against starvation. A shiver down my spine might recall the sting of a whip. Instead of defeat, I framed it as a reminder that I had not yielded. KL, ever the seer in fractured time, noticed the change. You walk differently. He told me one cycle, as if the chains are still there but lighter now. They are lighter. I replied, not because they loosened, but because I carry them differently. The transformation was not dramatic, not sudden. There was no single moment of liberation, but slowly, incrementally, the flesh that had been written upon by cruelty began to serve me instead of them. My scars did not vanish, but they no longer defined me as victim. They became emblems of a self that had passed through fire and had not been consumed. Kamor itself seemed to notice, not the city in any conscious sense, but the way others looked at me shifted. Overseers who once regarded me as broken now watched with suspicion, as though sensing a deviation from their intended design. Other slaves looked with quiet recognition, glimpsing in me the possibility of something beyond endurance. Even predators, in their perverse way, seemed intrigued by prey that carried scars as though they were armor. This was not freedom, not yet. The city still held me within its labyrinth, its endless cycle of torment and survival. But within that cycle, I had found the beginnings of autonomy. The flesh remembers, yes, but memory need not bind. It can also guide, reframe, empower. The scars of Kamora had been written by dark Eldar hands. But now they told a story they could not erase, the story of one who endured and chose to carry that endurance toward transformation, and in that reinterpretation, a new self began to emerge, one no longer bound solely by the chains of pain, but reshaped by it into something the dark Eldar could not fully comprehend. Kamora does not permit neutrality. In its endless feasts of cruelty, one is always either predator or prey. To the dark Eldar, this division is sacred, a cosmic truth made flesh in their city of knives and shadows. Survival requires feeding, and feeding requires suffering. They are parasites of souls, draining vitality through torment to keep the hunger of their patron slain at bay. In such a system, the weak are devoured, the strong ascend, and the cycle perpetuates without mercy. For a long time, I believed myself prey-meat to be consumed, a vessel emptied for their pleasure, and in their terms, my suffering sustained them. My fear flavored their ecstasies, my blood filled their chalices. Yet in time, through adaptation, I began to see the cracks in their dichotomy. Predator and prey are not fixed states, they are roles, masks donned and discarded according to circumstance. In the endless theater of Kamora, one can shift between them, sometimes within the span of a heartbeat. Kel sensed it before I did. His fractured sight glimpsed moments not yet solidified. You walk on both edges, he told me once, eyes distant, words trembling with echoes of timelines colliding. Neither predator nor prey. Something else, something they do not see. At first, I dismissed it. How could I be anything but prey? Bound, scarred, and controlled. But the more I observed, the clearer it became. Predators in Kamora are not invincible. Their power depends on the system, on the constant presence of victims. They are chained as much as we are enslaved to their own need for agony. Addicted to cruelty as sustenance, they strike with elegance. But beneath that elegance is desperation. Without prey, they wither. Without fear, their dominion collapses. That realization shifted something within me. Prey I might appear, But I carried within me the one thing they required to survive. My suffering. That meant power. As long as I endured, as long as I refused to break into the silence of true despair, I held leverage, however subtle. They could flay my body, poison my veins, fracture my bones, but the meaning of that torment was mine to shape. They feasted, yes, but I remained. One cycle, I was chosen for a demonstration, a display of artistry in pain before an audience of Cabalites and their Sybaritic masters, the Tormentor, a live figure with blades. Extending from her fingertips, sought to draw beauty from my screams. She moved with precision, carving shallow lines across my chest, orchestrating my responses like a conductor with an unwilling instrument. But instead of giving her what she desired, I chose silence. Each cut burned. Each strike begged for release. But I pressed my lips shut, my body trembling not with cries, but with restraint. The crowd murmured in frustration. The tormentor grew impatient, her strikes harsher, less elegant. She demanded my voice, but I denied her the satisfaction. In that moment, I realized I was no longer simply prey. I was shaping the encounter, forcing her to break form, disrupting the ritual of dominance. Ker later whispered, "You shifted the pattern. You fed her hunger, differently fed it with denial." His words made me understand. Even prey can defy the predator's script. Refusal is its own form of attack. From then on, I experimented. Sometimes I withheld screams, denying them their feast. Other times I exaggerated, turning pain into grotesque performance that mocked their artistry. Each act unsettled them, however slightly. They expected predictability in suffering. I gave them deviation. In doing so, I discovered a power they could not fully control, the power to rewrite the dynamics of predator and prey. This was not rebellion, not in the open sense. To rise against them directly was impossible. Their cruelty was backed by an empire of blades, poisons, and psychic terrors. But rebellion does not always roar, it can whisper, subtle and insidious, undermining assumptions. In refusing to be prey as they defined it, I stepped into a liminal space they did not understand, and there, between predator and prey, I began to glimpse a different kind of existence, not dominance, not submission, but something that blurred the lines, a self that adapted, transformed, and endured without belonging to either side of their sacred dichotomy. Camorra continued its eternal feast round me. Predators struck, prey screamed, and the cycle churned on. But within me, something shifted irreversibly. I was no longer content to be a piece on their board. I was no longer willing to accept their roles as the only possibilities. In the anomalous realm between predator and prey, I found the first true taste of freedom. Camorra is not a city built for a permanence. It is a shifting labyrinth, a web of contradictions, sustained not by stone or steel, but by hunger. Its towers rise impossibly high, their spires piercing into fractured skies, while its underways sink endlessly downward into pits of shadow and despair. To call it architecture would be misleading. It is not built, it festers, grows, metastasizes. Corridors twist into new configurations overnight. Plazas collapse into voids, and bridges extend like tongues licking across impossible gaps. Those who live here understand that stability is an illusion. The city devours itself, piece by piece, and in doing so, renews its cruelty. A market street teeming with flesh peddlers one cycle may become an execution ground the next. A temple devoted to exquisite torture might collapse into a canyon of black glass, only to re-emerge later in a different district. The city is alive, its pulse fed by the suffering of those trapped within it. To walk Camorra is to be swallowed by a predator that never stops feeding. For slaves like me, the instability was both curse and opportunity. Cursed, because safety could never be found. Walls that sheltered you one moment might open to reveal new tormentors the next. But opportunity, 2. Because unpredictability created cracks in which defiance could take root. The Dark Eldar relied on fear to maintain control, yet fear is most effective when patterns are stable. In chaos, patterns break, and with them, expectations. Kel thrived in this chaos. His perception of time, fractured and nonlinear, made sense of what baffled me. The city is not random. He murmured as we walked through a shifting corridor that seemed to breathe. It follows rhythm ancient, deliberate, cruel, but ordered. He spoke of architects who had long since faded, masters who designed Kamura to be a maze not only of space but of possibility. They set it in motion millennia ago. We are walking in echoes of their hunger. I did not fully grasp his meaning, but I trusted his vision. While I saw only corridors collapsing and streets twisting, he traced threads of intention, running through the chaos. His guidance spared us more than once, steering us away from an arena about to erupt in slaughter, or pulling me back from a plaza that moments later was consumed in a psychic firestorm. Living in a city that devours itself forced adaptation, I learned to read the signs of change. The faint vibration in a wall before it shifted, the scent of ozone heralding a war tear, the subtle silence before a district collapsed. These were not instincts I had possessed as a human. They were forged in me through immersion, as though the city itself was training me to survive within its endless transformations. But adaptation was not enough. To endure in Kamura without becoming prey, one must also learn to exploit its hunger. I began to notice how predators, too, were ensnared by the city's instability. A Kabbalite warrior, elegant and cruel in one plaza, could be swallowed by shifting architecture the next. A homunculus, master of flesh and torment, might find his laboratory severed from its foundations, his creation scattering into the streets. In these moments, the predators became prey if only for a breath. That realization struck me with clarity. Kamura feeds on all, not only the weak. Its cruelty spares no one, not even those who believe themselves masters. I began to hold on to that truth like a talisman. The Dark Eldars' dominion was vast, their cruelty unimaginable, but they, too, lived under the city's hunger. Their power was not absolute. Their survival, like mine, depended on navigating instability. That knowledge gave me strength. If even they were bound, then the chains I bore were not uniquely mine. In that shared bondage, however unequal, I found the seed of defiance. One night, if nighted, was Kel and I stood on a balcony overlooking the sprawl, the horizon fractured into shards of light and shadow, towers leaning as though drunk on their own corruption. From below, the screams of captives mingled with the laughter of their tormentors. Above, a ripple in the sky suggested another district folding into existence. Kel's voice was soft, almost reverent. They think they control the city, but the city controls them. It eats them as surely as it eats us. I turned to him, the truth settling like fire in my chest. Then we're all prey. No, Kel replied, eyes reflecting. Countless futures, we're all caught. But some of us learn to move differently in the net. From that moment, my view of Kamura changed. It was no longer merely a prison of torment. It was a predator of predators, an endless cycle devouring itself. And within that cycle, perhaps, there was room to slip between its teeth. The deeper we moved through Kamura, the more I became aware of the chains I still carried. They were not the iron links that bound the wrists of slaves, nor the collars etched with runes of subjugation. My chains were subtler, woven into flesh and thought. They whispered in the rhythm of my altered heartbeat, in the reflexive obedience coded into my nerves, in the memories of pain that surfaced whenever I hesitated. The homunculi had not merely reshaped my body, they had carved their ownership into me. Every scar, every graft, every neural enhancement was a reminder of their dominion. I had become their masterpiece of cruelty, a living tool, perfected to serve. That truth pressed on me like a weight even after I had broken from their grasp. Kel noticed it before I confessed it. "You still listen to them," he said one cycle as we rested, in the shadow of a fractured tower. His voice was not accusatory, but knowing. "I listened to what they left in me," I admitted. "Commands etched into reflex, pain that echoes when I move against their design." He studied me with those eyes that seemed never fixed in one timeline. "Then use it. They built you to adapt. Adapt even to their control." His words unsettled me. I had thought of adaptation as survival, a means of enduring what had been inflicted upon me. But Kel spoke of something different, turning the very instruments of control into tools of resistance. If the chains whispered commands, then perhaps I could change the meaning of those whispers. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. We crossed into a district scarred by a recent disjunction. Buildings twisted upon themselves. Walkways hung suspended over voids, and shadows moved with a will not their own. Patrols of incubi prowled the ruins, their black armor gleaming with menace, their clives sharp enough to shear bone from flesh in a breath. They were the silent enforcers of Comora's order, loyal to their cabal's masters, and yielding in pursuit. One group intercepted us, 6 of them, blades raised, visors reflecting our warped images. Flight was impossible. The shifting architecture left no clear paths. Combat seemed equally hopeless. Kel's temporal disjunction gave him advantage, but even he could not face 6 incubi without risk. It was then that the chains whispered again. Reflexive commands pulsed through me. Kneel. Obey. Submit. I felt the weight of my conditioning pressing down, demanding surrender. For a moment, my knees bent, shame surging hot through me. But Kel's earlier words struck like a blade. Use it. I did not silence the chains. I redirected them. Instead of submitting to the incubi, I submitted to the reflex of movement itself. My body dropped low, not in surrender, but in preparation. My hands, designed by the homunculi for precision and cruelty, moved without conscious thought. Where once they had obeyed a master's command to flay and dissect, now they tore at the joints of the nearest incubi, striking with inhuman speed. Surprise broke their formation. Kel slipped through the gap I created, his body flickering in and out of alignment with time. Blades swung where he had been, cutting only after images. I followed, not as prey, not as slave, but as something else, something the homunculi had not intended. We fought not to destroy, but to escape. The incubi recovered quickly, their discipline, unshaken, but the chains whispered again, guiding my limbs into unnatural patterns of defense and evasion. Every strike that should have ended me instead passed inches away, redirected by reflexes, once intended to serve others. When we finally broke free of the patrol, lungs burning, the realization struck me with clarity. The chains had not been broken, they never could be, but they had been turned. The whispers remained, but their meaning had shifted. No longer commands of submission, but signals of survival, tools to be wielded, not masters to be obeyed. Kel smiled faintly, his voice soft as though he had seen this moment long before it arrived. The chains are still there, but now they belong to you. For the first time since my capture, I felt the weight lessen. Not gone, never gone, but transformed. Chains could bind, yes, but they could also anchor, sharpen, remind. They no longer whispered surrender. They whispered possibility. As we moved deeper into the shifting city, I carried them not as burdens, but as proof that what was meant to enslave me could instead become the foundation of something new. Comora still hungered, still devoured. But within me, the whisper of chains had changed its song. The further we drift from the heart of Comora, the more its phantom tendrils cling to memory. The Dark City is not merely a place, but a state of being, a labyrinth woven from cruelty, ambition, and perpetual hunger. Even in distance, its presence lingers, like a toxin coursing through veins long after the wound has closed. To be shaped by such a place is to carry its mark forever, yet whether that mark is curse or foundation for transformation depends on what we make of it. Kell often reminds me that perception is not neutral. His fractured grasp of time, once a source of torment, now grants him an uncanny ability to anticipate the unfolding of dangers before they crystallize. He speaks of the city not as lost prison, but as an ongoing influence that reverberates across the webway. He is not wrong. Kamura is never still. Its streets, towers, and arenas twist with each cycle of predation, reshaping to accommodate new cruelties. Its inhabitants know no peace, only the shifting tides of hierarchy and betrayal. It is a city where one's worth is measured in suffering inflicted and endured for those who never lived within its walls. Kamura is myth. To those of us who escaped, it is scar. But scars can harden into armor. My own body, reforged under Dark Eldar, experimentation, still remembers every incision, every forced adaptation, yet those very changes provide resilience that ordinary flesh could never sustain. I move with the memory of chains, but I also move beyond them. The labyrinth remains in me, but I refuse to remain in it at times, though I sense the pull of its gravity. Dreams return me to the arenas, where the crowd's shrieks were both torment and proof of survival. Waking, I feel the phantom weight of shackles, the echo of blades drawn across bone. Kamura is patient. It waits within memory, ready to reclaim those who falter. This is why we cannot simply flee. We must redefine what was done to us. To reject it outright is to deny what we have become. To embrace it without transformation is to surrender to the city's dominion. Kel, and I walk a narrow path. He sees cycles where I see choices. He calls my insistence on freedom a temporal illusion, for in his vision, every choice has already been played out, across countless possible timelines. Yet, even if the outcome is predetermined in some vast cosmic structure, the act of choosing matters. Defiance is itself a form of creation, a thread cut from the web that Kamura would weave round us. We speak often of what it means to exist outside. There is no utopia awaiting us, no promised land untouched by cruelty. But there is possibility, denied to all who remain within the labyrinth. Out here, we can construct meaning not dictated by endless cycles of predation. Our survival does not require another's suffering. Our evolution is not bound to the sadism of masters who hunger for the agony of others. Still, the labyrinth tests us, stray too far into its memory, and despair threatens to consume, forget its lessons, and vulnerability returns. To walk between these extremes requires constant vigilance. Freedom is not a gift, but a practice, one we must renew with every breath. Kamura's shadow lengthens behind us, stretching into the future we now attempt to shape. We are not naive enough to believe we have escaped it entirely. Instead, we accept that it lives within us, even as we live beyond it. From that paradox, a new identity emerges, scarred yet sovereign, haunted yet unbroken. The labyrinth made us, but it does not own us. And so we continue forward into uncertainty, into danger, into the vast uncharted realms that lie beyond any city's dominion. Whatever we become, it will be ours to define. There are moments when the body betrays me, reminding me of what it endured in. Kamura, a shiver runs through my nerves at the memory of blades. A twitch echoes where scars no longer show. The Dark Eldar did not merely wound flesh, they rewrote it, sculpting muscle and bone. To serve their games, my hands still move with reflexes they implanted. Reflexes designed for combat, for spectacle, for survival in the arena. Though I loathe the source of these alterations, I cannot deny their usefulness. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Each movement carries with it the residue of pain, but also the imprint of adaptation. When I lift a blade now, I do not wield it as a prisoner performing for an audience. I wield it as a free agent, shaping my own survival, my own destiny. What was once forced upon me has been reclaimed. The flesh may still bear the echoes of Kamura, but it no longer belongs to it. Kel sees these transformations differently. To him, they are markers of a timeline diverging. He insists that the self is not linear, that what I call me is merely one expression among infinite variations. His perception of time makes my scars seem less permanent in his eyes. Where I see wounds that define me, he sees branching paths where perhaps those wounds never occurred or where they cut even deeper. For Kel, identity is not a fixed point, but a flux. Yet for all his strange perspective, he admits something that matters. My scars, my adaptations, my reclaimed strength, they anchor me in a way he cannot anchor himself. His fractured perception of time makes it difficult for him to remain rooted in a single moment. He drifts between possibilities, struggling to hold on to one thread of selfhood. I, on the other hand, am bound by the weight of what I endured. My flesh keeps me tethered to this reality, and in that tethering lies a kind of stability. Even if born from suffering, the paradox becomes clear. Kamura tried to strip me of identity, reducing me to nothing more than a spectacle for their cruelty. Yet by enduring, by surviving, I found something indelible. The body altered, yes, the spirit scarred, undeniably. But in their attempt to erase me, they left behind something more resilient than they intended. In that resilience, I find a freedom they could never comprehend. This freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to use pain without being consumed by it. Every mark etched into my being is both a reminder and weapon, a testament to what was inflicted and to what I reclaimed. Kel sometimes asks me if I would undo it all, if I could choose a path. And touched by Kamura's shadow, my answer is always the same: no, for without those shadows, I would not exist as I do now. And perhaps that is the lesson neither Kamura nor its masters ever understood. Suffering may break bodies, but it can also forge them into something ungovernable. They sought to fashion tools, and instead they created agents of defiance. My flesh, their canvas, became my armor. My memory, their weapon, became my story. Now, beyond the labyrinth, I walk with both flesh and memory as companions. I am no longer what I was, but neither am I what they wanted me to be. I am something else, something forged in cruelty, but reborn in freedom. The webway shifts round us like a living maze. Once, its twisting passages served only to funnel victims toward Kamura, to feed the city's endless hunger. Now, as Kel and I travel its shifting arteries, I see it differently, not as a trap, but as a mirror of our own transformation. The web is fractured, unstable, yet alive. Every pathway we walk reflects the precarious balance between order and chaos that defines existence itself. Kel senses these fractures before they manifest. To him, the threads of the webway shimmer with futures unspooled, some collapsing into nothing, others binding together into dangerous knots. He warns me of paths where shadows thicken into ambushes, where predators stalk unseen. His perception is not flawless. Time for him is both gift and torment, but it spares us from falling blindly into snares that would devour us whole. The dark Eldar call themselves masters of the webway, yet even they are slaves to its deeper will. They believe themselves predators at the pinnacle of creation, but their survival is chained to cycles of cruelty they cannot escape. Kamura feasts because it must, not because it chooses. Its labyrinth of towers and tunnels thrives on suffering. Consuming agony is sustenance against the hunger of she who thirsts. They call it power, but I see only desperation woven into every act of sadism. Outside those walls, in the liminal spaces of the fractured web, I see the truth. Control is an illusion. The web bends not to the will of tormentors, but to the weight of adaptation itself. It endures because it changes. It survives because it reshapes. The same truth applies to us. Kamora tried to freeze me into a roller prisoner, a spectacle, a broken tool. Instead, I became fluid, shifting beyond its definitions. The deeper we move into these shifting corridors, the more I realize that survival here requires more than strength. It requires surrender to the fact that nothing is fixed. Identity, purpose, even reality itself all are mutable. Kel thrives in this realization. His fractured sense of time becomes a compass where ordinary perception falters. For me, the lesson is harder. I cling to scars, to the solidity of flesh and memory. Yet the webway whispers that even scars are temporary, that everything bends given enough time. Sometimes I wonder if we are truly escaping, or if we are simply moving into another layer of the labyrinth, one larger, more subtle, but still bound by rules we do not yet comprehend. Perhaps freedom itself is not an absolute state, but a shifting point along a spectrum of constraints. If that is true, then the best we can claim is not release but redefinition. Still, I choose to walk. I choose to press forward into uncertainty. Rather than return to the certainty of Kamora's chains, the fractured web may be unstable, but it offers possibilities that the city never could. Each fracture is both a danger and an opening, a chance to step into futures not yet dictated by cruelty. Kel once told me that the web is not a structure but a someone endlessly recomposed by those who dare to listen. If that is true, then perhaps we are not just travelers within it, but notes in its evolving melody, notes shaped by suffering. Yes, but now resonating with defiance, Kamora will continue its feast. Its masters will continue their cycles, but beyond their reach, in the fractures of the web, another rhythm begins to emerge, a rhythm of survival without servitude, of adaptation without subjugation, of freedom, however fragile, written into the very fabric of existence. And as long as that rhythm continues, so too will we dot in the labyrinthine corridors of the fractured webway. Silence is not emptiness. It is weight. It presses against the skin, filling the lungs, amplifying every heartbeat until the body itself becomes an echo chamber. In Kamora, silence was rare, broken by screams, by laughter sharpened into cruelty, by the constant clash of blades and the roar of an insatiable crowd. Out here, in the forgotten paths between realities, the silence feels alien, almost unbearable. At first, I mistook it for a peace, a reprieve from torment, a balm for nerves frayed by years of spectacle and pain. But soon I realized silence has its own voice. It forces me inward, back into the chambers of memory where no sound is needed for a torment to persist. The laughter of tormentors, the hiss of blades, the sickening crunch of bone, they return without need of ears, conjured whole by silence itself. Kel experiences it differently. His fractured perception of time fills every moment with overlapping strands of possibility. To him, silence is crowded. He hears voices that never spoke, battles that never occurred, futures collapsing and reborn in the same breath. He tells me the silence is alive, that it vibrates with the hum of unchosen outcomes. For me, silence is memory. For him, it is possibility. And yet, both weigh heavily. The burden of memory drags me backward, chaining me to Kamora's shadow. The burden of possibility threatens to scatter Kel, dissolving him into too many selves at once. Between us, we anchor one another. My scars tether him to the present. His fractured foresight loosens my grip on the past. Together, we navigate the silence. It is in these stretches of quiet that I come through the hardest truth. Freedom is not the erasure of What came before Kamura is gone, but it is not gone from me. Its chains have dissolved, but the marks they left endure. The silence reminds me that even without walls, I carry a prison within. I cannot outrun it. I cannot destroy it. What I can do, what I must do, is transform it. This is where the weight of silence becomes a forge in its pressure. I feel myself reshaping, not into what Kamura designed, not into what my past self mourned, but into something new. Silence does not demand cruelty. It demands honesty. He strips away distractions until only truth remains, and the truth is this: I am both scar and survivor, weapon and wielder, memory and future. I am not one thing. I am many. K.L. smile. Yes, when I confess this to him, he says that I am beginning to see, as he does, that identity is never singular, never fixed from me. It is not a revelation, but a surrender. To accept multiplicity is to release the need for a singular self, to stop mourning what I was and instead embrace the shifting forms of what I am becoming. And in that surrender, the silence begins to change. It no longer suffocates. It expands. It becomes space of vastness where new possibilities can take root. Perhaps this is what freedom feels like. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of space in which to move. In Kamura, silence meant anticipation of pain. Here, silence means possibility of creation. Between the weight of memory and the pull of futures, I begin to find balance. Not peace, not yet, but balance, and with balance comes resilience. The silence still presses heavy, but I no longer carry it alone. Kamura taught me one law above all: survival comes only at the expense of another. Every arena battle, every ambush in its shadowed alleys, every feast of agony in its torture chambers reinforced the same lesson: predator or prey. Nothing else. The weak existed only to nourish the strong. The strong lived only by inflicting more pain. Now, out here in the broken arteries of the webway, I test what it means to live without prey. The silence kill, and I inhabit stretches between us like uncharted wilderness. And in that wilderness, no captors demand blood. No crowd hungers for a spectacle. The question grows sharper each day. What does survival mean when it is no longer measured in suffering inflicted? Kell answers with paradoxes. He tells me that survival is not a line but a loop, not a conquest but an exchange. He sees timelines where we are predators, others where we are prey, and countless in-between states where the distinction collapses. To him, the concept of the hunt is flawed from the beginning, an invention of those too afraid to see themselves as part of the whole. I struggle with this. My instincts, honed in Kamura, still urge me to watch shadows, to measure threats, to strike before being struck. Every muscle remains tuned to the law of predator and prey. Yet when no adversary emerges, when no trap springs, I find myself restless, waiting for the cruelty that does not come. Freedom, it seems, has its own terrors, but slowly the pattern shifts. I begin to see what Kell means. Out here, existence does not demand cruelty. The fractured webway itself adapts without malice, reshaping corridors not to hunt but to endure. It is not predator, it is not prey. It is survival expressed through transformation. Perhaps we can do the same. For the first time, I attempt to act without the shadow of necessity, to move not because a blade is at my throat, but because I choose to rest not in anticipation of the next sandwich, but because my body requires it, to imagine a future that is not an endless cycle of cruelty, but something other, not utopia, not safety, but something unchained. And yet, the past still claws at me. The hunger of Kamura whispers in memory. Without prey, you will starve. Without prey, you are nothing. I hear it in the phantom screams of victims I once stood among. In the echo of crowds demanding blood, the hunt lingers like an addiction. To live without it feels both liberating and terrifying. As if I stand on the edge of a chasm without knowing if I can fly, Kel steadies me. He reminds me that freedom is not absence, but choice. If I choose not to hunt, I am not weak. If I choose to shape existence on different terms, I am not prey. The law of predator and prey was never law at all, only the delusion of a city enslaved to its hunger. Out here, I can write a different law. So I begin to practice each day. I test small acts of selfhood not defined by the hunt. To share silence with Kel without expecting betrayal. To walk corridors without anticipating ambush. To shape memory into story rather than weapon. These are small rebellions, but they are mine, and perhaps, in time, survival itself will take on a new meaning. Not survival against another, but survival with Kel. With the fractured webway, with the shifting self I continue to become. The hunt without prey is disorienting, but it may also be the first true taste of freedom. Even as we move deeper into the fractures of the webway, Kimura follows, not in flesh, not in the cruel masters or the endless arenas, but in ghosts. They come to me when the corridors grow too quiet, when the silence presses too heavily, phases I knew only from moments before they were torn apart, screams that were silenced too quickly, or lingered too long. The city feasted on them, but in some way, I carry them still. At first, I thought these phantoms were only memories, but memories fade. These do not. They return with clarity, too sharp to dismiss the shape of a jaw, the burn of a gaze, the trembling of a hand reaching toward me before the blades descended. They arrive in silence. They depart in silence, and yet they weigh upon me like 1,000 shackles I thought I had broken. Kel notices when they come. He tilts his head, as if listening to voices only I cannot hear, then says softly, "They are not only behind you, they are beside you." His fractured perception of time makes him see them as more than echoes. To him, they are possibilities, selves unchosen, threads cut from the great weave, the woman whose scream I still dream. Of Kel insists she exists in another branch, walking still. The child whose eyes burned with defiance, Kel claims he grows into a warrior elsewhere. But I am not Kel. To me, these are not alternate selves. They are the dead. They are the ones who never escaped, and though I live, they linger in me, demanding recognition. Sometimes I wonder if I carry them because of guilt. I survived where they did not. I adapted, endured, broke free. Does that make me a thief of their futures? Do I live at their expense, as surely as I once fought at the expense of others in the arenas? The ghosts whisper. No answers. They only remain, silent and unyielding. Yet as the days stretch on, I begin to notice something else. The ghosts no longer only haunt, they guide. Their faces sharpen not just in pain, but in fragments of strength. The woman's scream, once torment, now reminds me of the courage to resist. The child's gaze becomes a spark against despair. Even the broken, the forgotten, the erased through me, some part of them endures. Kel calls this inheritance. He believes each scar, each memory, is a thread that ties me not only to my own survival but to theirs. You are not one self, he says, but many selves carried forward. To him, my body and mind are archives, repositories of those Kimura tried to erase, and though I resist his strange language, a part of me wonders if he is right. If that is true, then perhaps the ghosts are not chains. Perhaps they are seeds, seeds of defiance, of resilience, of futures that Kimura sought to devour but could not wholly consume. In me, they find voice again. In me, they step beyond the city's endless feast. I still wake to their faces in the dark. I still feel the weight of their presence pressing against my ribs. But where once I saw only torment, now I begin to see responsibility. to live not only for myself, but for all those silenced too soon, to shape a story that honors what they endured, and to ensure Kimura's hunger does not define the end of their memory. The ghosts walk with me, and perhaps, in walking, they too are free. The anomalous realm shifts round us, reshaping itself in response to thought, intention, and the strange fusion of memory and possibility we carry. Unlike the rigid spires of Kimura, which cut into the sky like weapons raised against their own people, this place has no single form. Its architecture is liquid, bending to the pressure of our desires, fears, and unspoken needs dart at first. This frightened me. I had grown used to the certainty of cruelty, the unchanging fact of predation. Kimura offered no kindness, but at least its cruelty was predictable. Here, there is no fixed ground, a structure that shields us one moment may dissolve the next. A path across a shining plain can collapse into rivers of light when doubt seeps into the mind. Reality bends, and in bending, it asks, what shape do you choose to become? Kel thrives here. His fractured existence, always caught between one moment and the next, finds harmony in the instability. Where I see danger in the shifting, he sees potential. He shows me how to breathe into the flux, how to let intention guide the landscape. When fear drives the shape, it twists into cages, into shadows, into hungry mouths. But when I allow purpose to flow through me, the realm responds with forms that sustain rather than devour. It is not easy. Too much of me was forged in Kimura's fires, the memories of torture, the lessons of submission and survival, push constantly at the edges of my thought. When I falter, the realm answers in kind walls closing in, echoes of laughter sharp as blades, chains sprouting from the ground. But I do not remain there. Kel reminds me, adaptation means not erasing what has been, but transforming it. I take the chains and wool them into bridges. I take the blades and turn them into wings. Slowly, the realm begins to reflect not only the pain of my past, but the possibility of my future. Here, my modifications cease to feel like shackles. The neural pathways carved for a calculation expand into comprehension of patterns the human mind could not fathom. The flesh, reshaped through pain, becomes a canvas of resilience rather than merely a mark of ownership. I am not human as I once was, nor am I the perfected experiment my master intended. I am something in between, and perhaps beyond. The ghosts of Kimura remain, but they too begin to change. Once they came as torment, then as memory, then as responsibility. Now they join in the shaping. Their voices, silent before, whisper at the edges of thought, guying the forms I call forth. 1,000 selves, not mine yet carried within me, press into the fabric of this place, leaving marks that strengthen rather than weaken. Where Kimura consumed them, this realm resurrects them. If not in flesh, then in resonance. I begin to understand what Kel means when he says becoming. It is not a fixed state, not a destination. It is a process, continuous and without end. To live is to become, again and again, shedding skins that no longer serve, adopting forms that answer the demands of each new environment. Kimura taught me this truth through cruelty. Here, I learn it through choice. One night or what passes for night in. This place where time bends, I sit beside Kel and ask him, what are we now? He tilts his head, his eyes reflecting light that does not come from any sun. We are not victims, he says, nor are we tools. We are the shape of becoming, neither bound to the past nor severed from it. We carry it forward, transform it, and in doing so, we create something new. His words settle in me, like a seed, and for the first time, I feel not only survival, not only endurance, but creation, a life not simply endured or stolen, but shaped by my own will. Perhaps this is freedom, not the absence of limits, but the power to decide which limits define us, not a return to innocence, which was lost the moment the Dark Eldar took me, but a step into a state no one intended me to reach, something beyond human, beyond Rak, beyond the hunger of Gamora. The realm bends gently round us as if in agreement, its colors softening, its patterns aligning to our shared thought. And I know then, becoming has no end. It is the path itself. The path does not end. That is the first lesson of this new existence. Gamora taught me that endings are inevitable. Every scream must be silenced. Every captive must break. Every experiment must conclude in success or failure. But here, in the anomalous realm, I begin to see that endings are illusions. What feels final is only a transition, one shape flowing into another, one state dissolving into the next. I look back not in space, not in time, but in memory. I see the Rak I once was, the human I once had been. The countless selves lost between those 2 points. I see the master who carved my flesh, the incubi who enforced his will, the Lady Malice who ruled with cruelty. I see the ghosts of captives who never made it this far, their eyes bright with pain, their voices silenced too soon. They are all with me still, threads woven into my being. I carry them, but I am not crushed by their weight. They are the foundation of what I am becoming. Kel walks beside me, more stable now than he ever was within the confines of the Dark City. Here, his desynchronization is not an affliction, but a gift. He perceives paths where I see only fog, possibilities where I see only walls. Together, we move through this mutable reality, not as fugitives, not as broken tools, but as travelers. The difference is profound. To flee is to run from something. To travel is to move toward. This place, with its shifting forms and fluid laws, offers no comfort of permanence. But perhaps permanence was never a gift, only a cage disguised as stability. I have come to understand that freedom is not the absence of chains, but the power to choose which bonds I accept, which forms I take, which rules I shape to my own ends. I am not human, though I remember humanity. I am not Eldar, though their cruelty forged me. I am not a Rak, though the scars remain etched in every nerve and tendon. I am something else, something that carries the lessons of all 3 but belongs to none of them. In Gamora, this indeterminacy would have marked me as a monstrosity, a failed experiment. Here, it becomes my strength. The realm bends with me. When I imagine shelter, it builds. When I imagine wings, it grants me flight. When I imagine bridges, they form under my feet. This is not power without cost. Each shaping requires clarity, intention, and acceptance of what it means to bear the responsibility of creation. But it is mine, not stolen, not forced. Kel once said that adaptation continues beyond known parameters. Now I see what he meant. Gamora was not the end of my story. It was a crucible. It broke me, reshaped me, taught me to endure what no one should. But in doing so, it also gave me tools I now wield for myself. The Dark Eldar sought to strip me of identity, to make me nothing but an instrument. Instead, they taught me the truth that identity is never fixed, always mutable. I walk now not as a prisoner, not as a survivor, but as something new. The ghosts walk with me, not as tormentors but as companions. Their memories guide my choices, their strength fuels my becoming. Perhaps this is not freedom in the simple sense. Perhaps freedom, as I once imagined it, never existed. But this space between definitions, this power to shape, this refusal to be defined by those who sought to own me, this is enough, more than enough. The chains of Gamora lie broken behind me, not erased, not forgotten. but transformed into the first links of a path leading forward. And as long as I walk it, as long as I continue to become, the Dark City has not won. Adaptation continues, evolution persists. And beyond the chains, I am becoming the storm of memories, the labyrinth of shadows, the endless corridors of cruelty and change. All of it now recedes, as though viewed through a veil slowly, drifting backward across a calm horizon. What once pressed with the weight of unrelenting violence and the sharp edges of fear now become softened, blurred into a distant landscape that no longer dictates the path forward. There is, instead, a sense of release, not in the form of triumph or finality, but in the quieter recognition that Endurance itself has carried us beyond the boundaries. Our city of chains continues somewhere far behind, its hunger still circling, its endless rituals still devouring. Yet that place does not reach here. Here the air moves differently, with a rhythm that no longer cuts but soothes, with a tempo that allows breath to expand fully and without hesitation. The body remembers, yes, but the body also heals. The mind recalls, yes, but the mind also reshapes. What was once imposed has become transformed, like iron cooled and bent into a gentler form. Still marked, but no longer defined by the fire that once sent. So we walk, not into another battlefield, not into another prison of rules and hierarchies, but into a space that allows for silence, for stillness, for the slow weaving of a future whose shape need not be decided all at once. The scars do not vanish, yet they no longer speak only of suffering. They speak also of survival. If you listen closely, you may hear it now. The faint rhythm of footsteps moving into open ground, the quiet breath of a story settling into rest, the whisper that says simply free.